Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Adult Chair on rashpixel.fm. I'm Pete Wright, and I am super thrilled to be here with Michelle Chalfant. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Pete.
Are you excited about today's show?
I'm very, very excited.
I can see it. I see you are glowing. You're glowing today. We are continuing our series on conscious parenting this week, but this time from the perspective of teens, and we have a fantastic guest to help us pull some of these teen challenges apart. Before we get to that, of course, head over to theadultchair.com to learn more about this show. You can subscribe for free by signing up for our mailing list, or find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, wherever finer podcasts are served. Join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter. We would love to hear from you. Dr. James Wellborn is a clinical psychologist who specializes in individual, family, and group psychotherapy with children and adolescents, addressing the range of challenges faced by families and teens during this period of development. In addition to his practice, he served as a consultant in schools, developing programs to support at-risk youth. He's a strong advocate on radio, TV, and print in helping parents support their child's healthy development. Dr. Wellborn is author of Raising Teens in the 21st Century, a practical guide to effective parenting that serves as a reference for parents addressing a whole host of teenage issues, and he is here to talk to us today about the challenges teens face in learning to live in their own adult chair. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
We have a lot to cover based on all you just said, Pete. I'm like, ooh, so many questions to ask.
Right, in 1 hour, we're going to cover the whole.
Just start checking them off the list.
Everything you just said in 1 hour.
Fish in a barrel,
I'm a little
Michelle.
stressed about
That's
that.
Right.
We have to do 2 or 3 shows, Jim. Well, I'm again thrilled to have you, and I really just want to jump right in because there's so many topics that I really want to get to today. But let's start with middle school. You know, I hear from a lot of my clients and friends and a lot of people that talk about what happens to their little angels when they hit 6th grade and they turn into someone that we don't know anymore. Something happens in 6th grade. I have people that ask me, like, is my child depressed or have anger issues or something's different? They're very internal. They want to spend a lot of time in their rooms. They don't want to talk to me anymore. So from your perspective, please enlighten us on what happens around that age.
Well, that's one of those big transition times for kids, and so consequently for parenting, where you're going to have to start shifting what you do as a parent from your childhood model of parenting to an adolescent model. And so it gets kind of tricky because of that. And the main reason for you needing to shift that is that there's like a ton of transitional changes that happen just developmentally with kids. So the first thing, which is the most obvious thing for most of us as parents, is all of the changes that happen with puberty and the ways in which those start changing both the physical experience of kids, but also about how they start looking at the world and how they're looking at each other, and about the whole unflowering and unfolding of sex and sexuality and sexual desire in a completely different way. So you've got kids who are kind of completely overwhelmed with these new things about what they're having to shift from themselves, and they're all confused about it too. And so a lot of the kind of surliness and a lot of the conflict is as much about kids not being able to know enough about what's going on with themselves and just being kind of hit with these things as it is anything else.
So it's more of a puberty kind of change that's creating all of this, as well as developmentally, some things are happening in the brain as well?
Well, sure. The puberty is kind of the biggest and I think for most of us most obvious, but there's also more subtle things that are going on neurobiologically as well. And then there's some changes that are going on cognitively. And so, for example, this is also the age when kids start being able to think in a much more sophisticated way. There's some famous developmental psychologists who talk a lot and studied for decades how kids start changing in the sophistication of their thinking. And so at this stage, when you're shifting from being a child to being an early adolescent, kids start being able to reflect on and actually understand what's going on in somebody else's head. And the early phase of that, when you just start being able to tell what's going on, that somebody else has a different thought. Younger kids don't think like that. They're cognitively not ready to do that. Well, young teenagers start being able to do that. And what that means is that they think that what's going on in somebody else's head is what's going on in their head. When they start worrying about stuff, they assume the other person is actually noticing that and reacting to it and thinking that about them. And so insecure kid starts being able to think that other people have thoughts in their head. They assume those thoughts are about how inadequate they are as a person. So they get really reactive. And that's with parents and peers and everybody. So that's kind of that's a cognitive change.
That is that's complete news to me.
Okay.
I had never and I have a middle schooler. And so you are just right now, you are blowing my mind, not just a little bit, Jim Wellborn, blowing my mind. So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned earlier about, you said that this is a time when parents need to change their parenting model from the young child model to the adolescent model. What does that mean?
I do every couple of months, I do a parenting seminar here in the area where I have my practice. And one of the things that I talk about is that there is a shift for parents that the way you tend to notice that is that exactly the same kind of parenting response that from this point backwards in time worked perfectly well, got no reaction from your kid, whatever. You say exactly the same thing in exactly the same situation and your kid will attack you. Mm-hmm. They change about their reactions to the kinds of direct instruction that is the prime ideal and appropriate parenting approach for kids. You tell them what to do. You give them instruction. You make sure that they do this and don't do that. That has to start shifting in adolescence. Now, you're still going to be doing that in the early phases of that, but the whole transition of parenting is about transferring that, to the kid rather than coming from you. And so they're supposed to increasingly be setting these limits on themselves and coming up with decisions, that kind of thing. So you're going to help them transition. So the first thing you notice is that when they're ready, they'll argue with you or yell at you. And then you'll know, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to have to start shifting to actually asking them things, to beginning to be more sensitive about the fact that they have their own thoughts in your head. And that doesn't mean you don't do it as a child. But when you're telling a kid to go and do some clean up their room, in their head, they're still going, rah, 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 rah. But outside, they go and clean up their room. One of the shifts that happens is now for teenagers, they're increasingly starting to feel more independent, the desire for independence. And so they have the same reaction in their head that they had a week ago or 6 months ago. But now they actually tell you what they're thinking, which is they're mad and angry and unhappy. And so it seems like something's gone terribly wrong. But really,
I was just going to say, I prefer the former.
Yeah, most of us do. So, although you might imagine, since I work almost exclusively with teenagers, I actually like that phase. And so in my house, my wife, who's a much more nurturing person than I am, was perfect for the kids. And during childhood, we both did kind of really nice things. And then she had to kind of step back during adolescence because the kids, my two kids drove her insane about kind of arguing and twisting her up and all of that kind of stuff. So I kind of moved in, but it's fun for me. But for most of us, it's really a struggle and a pain.
That's one of the things I've noticed, and with my younger son, it's still really easy for me to tell him both what to do and how to do it. And with my daughter, I can really only suggest maybe there's a possibility she might want to consider this one thing to do, and then I have to shut up.
How old is your son and how old is your daughter?
I've got a 9-year-old turning 10 tomorrow and 13 turning 14 just in a couple of months.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah. Bless your heart.
Did you just cross yourself? Wait.
I'm telling you, 7th grade horror, universally 7th grade, the worst year ever.
Well, luckily we made it through that. We're going into 9th next year, and that's my terror.
Oh. That is my question, Jim. So fast forward, I've got 2 teenage boys, a 9th grader and a 12th grader. How do you when is this phase over? It's still happening.
Okay. Here's
I become more and more embarrassing by the week. It seems like they don't want to be seen with me. Actually, my older one's changing that a little bit, but I remember going to the mall with them and I couldn't even I couldn't stand next. They wouldn't let me stand next to them. Like I was that embarrassing. I just, don't be seen with me.
Exactly. There's some of that kind of continuing developmental stuff that happens. One of the research findings that I think can be reassuring to parents is that conflict with your teenagers peaks in between 15 and 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that happens is that there is a natural and gradual increase of conflict between parents and their kids. And then at about 16, it starts to drop back down. And so that's one thing to keep in mind as a parent is that you're going to have more conflict. And one of the explanations for that, that makes sense to me is that as kids are beginning to be clearer about having their own ideas about things and having their own thoughts and opinions and their disagreements, what they don't have a lot of experience with is how to actually express that and communicate that in an interactive situation with somebody, especially somebody in authority. And so what happens is that they sit there and you're talking and they're getting madder and madder and madder, and they know they're right, but they don't have a lot of experience about how to both be mad and also communicate without yelling. And so it just bursts out of them.
Right. Right.
So what they're doing then, and then they start gradually learning basically how to be mad and still communicate in a civilized way. So that conflict is a reflection of their skill building about how to deal with this stuff. And that can also suggest some things to do from the parenting standpoint, if you think about it that way, as opposed to thinking about your kid being this defiant and disrespectful kid, although that can also go on. We're talking about in the normative range of things. We're not talking about, frankly, the book my book, Raising Teens in the 21st Century, is actually a parenting book for regular, typical parenting situations, not when you have a kid that's got different kinds of trouble that would come into my office. So, so this idea of parenting, though, with kids during this argumentative phase, is that you can actually help them by not taking it as just a sign of disrespect, but a skill deficit. And you say, okay, whoa, hang on. We need to have this conversation, but this screaming at me is not going to work because all it's going to do is going to make me want to punish you and make you suffer. And so chill out a minute and let's figure out how you can tell me what's going on here without hollering at me. Or some variation of that. I'm from the South, and so I've got my quaint Southern kind of style of doing that. But
hollering will enter into the equation at some point.
So that's a kind of idea about how knowing sometimes about these developmental things can actually give you some ideas about how to reinterpret what's going on and not make it all about your kid's gone crazy or a bad kid or that kind of thing.
Speaking of all these things that these kids are going through, we can misinterpret them as being, like I said, having anger issues or depression or anxiety, or again, when a kid just goes upstairs and I hear this from a lot of parents, and mine even did that, especially my older one. He used to just come up in his room and I thought, oh my God, is he depressed? What? So we really don't need to be labeling it as such. Of course, it could be that, but it sounds to me like this is just a normal phase of development. Yes?
Yeah, sure.
And they go through this inward, they're just more inside themselves and contemplative, and they don't want us around. And
maybe that's okay.
Yeah, and it's okay.
And it also depends on what they're doing in their room, and we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the idea of them needing time to themselves is one of those things that of course parents of teenagers have been aware of forever. But there's some different kind of research that's been addressing that actually somewhat indirectly. The concept of the alone time seems to be related, or has the possibility of being related, to this cognitive development change that's happening. And so when kids are able to reflect and introspect more, to actually examine inside themselves, to track their own emotions, to be more aware of what's going on inside of them, that's part of this cognitive leap that's happening too. Well, sorting that out can be difficult if you're getting a lot of stimulus from the outside. And so you can be overwhelmed by what's going on inside and outside. And so there's a natural kind of needing to have a quiet space and some time. So that's, of course, almost all of us as teen parents know that, and remembering our own teenage years, that there's some value in that. But the question then becomes, what's too much? That's usually the question that we end up with. And so you worry, if your kid is in there, like, this amount of time, is that a problem? There's some, it's not looked at directly. And so I've had to kind of pull from various places. But there's some folks who did some research a decade or more ago, maybe 2 decades now, that was looking at the life of teens. They tracked them and looked at how they spent their time and what was the amount of time they spent with friends and alone and with parents and all kinds of real-time data. Is really cool stuff. But then they tried to compare that to teens who are having different kind of difficulties, so that you could see whether more of this or less of that. And while they didn't quite calculate it this way, I actually went in and basically did some very simple math to figure out what the amount of alone time was. And so given all the things that teens are doing, if they get to about 2 hours or more of hanging out by themselves all alone, because, well, let me say, the research found that too little time was a predictor of problems, and too much time was predictor of problems, which, of course, what's the ideal? The Goldilocks syndrome. And so it looks like when you start getting about 2 hours of just alone time, that's where it starts moving into the too much time. And so we're looking at, somewhere about 1 to 2 hours in a regular day. And that's going to be, for many kids, especially in more ambitious households where they have their kids involved with all kinds of stuff, even that's going to be hard to find. They really don't have a lot of that downtime. So from the perspective of just time, but this research was done, and the people have looked at this when there wasn't access to the internet through electronics. And so part of the problem can be that even though they're alone in their room with regard to the family, that they're plugged in. And so they're still not getting alone time where they think they're simply in the room isolated from the family. So it's gotten more difficult to even sort this kind of thing out.
You took the words out of my mouth. I realize kids are getting their alone time, but they're going up and they're playing video games. They're on their computer playing a game, or they're on their phone for 2 hours or more. So if they're not getting this alone time that's so needed and they're plugged in all the time, what are you finding as far as the effects is it taking a toll on these kids? What are you finding in your practice?
What's being talked about, and what many parents are just naturally being able to observe, is that during adolescence, peers become significantly important to teenagers. That's part of the social developmental evolution that occurs during that time. At the same time, the problem with the access to the internet and our electronics that allow continual access to anybody all the time, that's kind of amped up the effects of peer influence, but it's also expanded it beyond any of the communities that typically in the past before the internet we could monitor and manage. You could only get to the people in your physical neighborhood. You could close off your house and people were not inside of it. Now, we had the television, and there was a milder version of this during my generation. I'm 56, and so maybe some of y'all's. But the point is that there was greater management and monitoring of that. And so right now, the issue of this alone time, which often is not talked about but still is important, kind of transfers over into the stuff we have to know and think about with regard to monitoring and managing and limiting access to media and the internet and that kind of stuff. So you see how it kind of moves us into a whole nother field, even though it's related to kind of regular and important adolescent development.
So what is healthy, would you say, for kids?
And that's really the bigger question for me too, is that is there a way to everything we hear about this is filled with such sort of just hyperbolic, panic.
Sure.
And so I wonder, is there a way? I mean, there is a certain case to be made about the nature of community and the nature of technology and kids and the cultural shift that we're experiencing beyond, just the panic and the things that kids can access. Is there a way to approach this healthily?
Well, yeah. The one piece of it is kind of the fundamental basic element is, unfortunately for us as parents, like so many things with parenting these days, you have to take charge of and be in the middle of what's actually going on with your kid.
Right.
And I say it that way because historically in human communities, the cultural umbrella that kind of everybody shared in a community, country, or geographic region helped enforce or actually communicate things to kids that their parents didn't have to communicate directly. We have to communicate everything directly now in the United States because gloriously we have the opportunity to live any kind of life we want, which is absolutely the wonder of this country. But it comes with a cost. And the cost is that we have to know more stuff. Well, that was fine enough when we were like doing kind of morals and regulating where they were spending, running out in the street or whatever. But now we've got this whole electronic thing. And so the first thing is there has to be some kind of monitoring system. You cannot take for granted that things will be okay if you just give your kid access to the internet. It is foolhardy, and there will be consequences that come from it. Now, let me add, that doesn't mean that, which will lead us to, so let me stop. So the first thing is about having monitoring devices on all of your equipment. And so your kid should not be able to access, especially late childhood, early to mid-adolescent kids, should not be able to access anything that you don't have some kind of monitoring component to, either by regulating when or how or what they can have access to, or it's tied electronically to your devices. Because what you may not appreciate is that while, I've been doing this now a while, and so when cell phones first came out, you couldn't do anything with them. It was all or nothing. Gradually, the companies, the industry has started providing with all kinds of options about limiting stuff, about making sure you know what's on your kid's phone, all that kind of stuff. So just the management of the devices and the access to the internet is crucial. And if you can't do it yourself, it's not very expensive to hire somebody to come in for a very concentrated way and get all that set up. So knowing that, monitoring that is one thing. But of course, that's trying to lock your kid in a closet, electronic closet, is not ever the answer. It's one of the things you have to try and do is monitor and manage. So the other thing is about communication, of course. It always comes back down and around to that. And that is both finding out what's going on with your kid, knowing more about who they're connecting with and what they're doing with their online time, wandering up there and having them engage in that while you're in the room and watching what's going on, watching while they're time spent in a way that, a generation ago, we could sit them in front of the television and you knew which channel was on there. Well, a generation and a half. Last generation, then HBO and all of the prime channels, had all kinds of mess on there. But so the idea, though, is to know what's going on with your kid. That's always been fundamental, and it's true here. It's just you have to expand into this area of their access to electronics and the internet.
Is there a certain age in high school that, because I'm thinking of my boys, and they say it's private. You shouldn't be able to look. This is my personal phone, and I say, well, I'm paying for your personal phone, so give it to me. But again, like that's what I say. But.
Yeah, that's an older teenage thing, and it's an important one because it is important for teenagers to have privacy and to have a personal space, and to have their own personal life, internal life.
So so then at what age do I loosen that? And I don't look all the time. I'm not connected to their phones, but at what age do I, because they do say that this is my, it's my space. It's kind of like their own room. You have your own rooms and my personal space, my personal phone. I'm having private conversations on here with my friends, and you shouldn't have to look.
Right.
So at what age do you start really pulling back? And
I've ended up saying that at 17, you have to just give up.
Yeah.
About everything.
Yeah. Kind of what I figured.
That doesn't mean,
Is that clinical advice, doctor?
I don't mean stop parenting. I mean, in your mind, you need to know that there's enough progression through adolescence, and there's enough there's been enough development of some of the core aspects of themselves,
right,
that there's you trying to have significant changes in your kid by your parenting at 17. I can't figure out a way to help parents do that. Okay. And so that's the nature of that. And I don't mean that in a kind of negative, pessimistic way. I mean, that's going to be the evolution of what you've been growing your kid to be. So part of what comes into that is you have to have trust in your kid. And it's going to have been important that you develop the sense of trust. And trust is in their judgment, not just in whether they're going to do what they say they're going to do, but if their judgment is good. And that's complicated because judgment really doesn't reach. The majority of people don't show adult levels of judgment until they're in their early 20s.
Right.
And so you've still got kids developing across this time, even though there's aspects of life and aspects of their kind of transitioning into young adulthood that cause that a problem. But focusing on that, and by the time they're 17, you are not feeling like you need to look as much in that stuff because you can see how they are. You can see what decisions they make. You can see what they're like as a person of character and integrity. You can see that, and there's some reason to have faith and confidence in that. It's all the way up to that where you're going to be having those arguments, which is, that's fine. So let me back up from 17. And so we're talking about, 15. We're talking about especially 13. Yes, you're right. That is a private conversation. But the problem is it's written down, and there's a lot, and you have access to things that are way beyond you having an individual conversation with your friend, because anybody can get in on that. It can go anywhere, and I have no idea who you're talking to. And it's my job as a parent, blah, 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 that old rationale. And then as they show you that they're more trustworthy and they are using that technology appropriately, then you give them more room with the understanding you're going to be coming back around. There's some things in the book. There's a chapter on technology stuff that's like how you think about this. I've even got I came up with a concept of having kids have to gradually earn greater access and freedom on the internet and with their electronic media, just like you would with a driver's license. And so there are these very specific and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because I tend to do that kind of stuff, but very specific things about how you have your kid demonstrate they are using this appropriately and they're not wandering into places that would be bad for them as a person, even though they have interest. And they're going to, but your job is also to get them get in the middle of that.
It seems like the cell phones and the age of the internet just exacerbates the stress that teenagers are under. What do you see as far as is there an increase in anxiety with these teens? Because I'm hearing about it, and maybe it's just because I don't see a lot of teens, but the ones that I see, they're coming to me for that. Are you noticing a shift there just in the last 20 years?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky because I tend to be a skeptical person, and I try very hard to stay very close to information about teenagers and families that comes from science and research, because it's so easy to be swayed by your own personal experience or the people around you. Okay. And especially for me as a therapist, where I'm seeing families where there's particular trouble, I can really be swayed by that. So one of the things I want to say is that while these things are real about anxiety and stress and depression and the instances of suicide and those things that worry and scare, and alcohol and drug use, all of those things have always been issues during for adolescents, and they are issues now. Here's the thing. The numbers on all of that, the peak, for example, the peak for alcohol and drug use was 1978. Since 1978, the reports of teenagers using alcohol and drugs has gone down dramatically since then. And then it kind of blipped up in the late 90s. In this kind of age of the legalization of marijuana, blipped some of that stuff back up. But it's still dramatically lessened. Okay, so this means we worry about that because there are kids, and those are issues. But that's not the same as saying terrible things are going on. Kids, from research, the data, 97% of kids say it's important to them to be a person of good character. 97% of kids.
Wow.
Okay,
that's data we really want to focus more on anyway.
Yeah, please.
Come on.
Wow.
57% of kids, when they've done when they've questioned them, volunteer. We think about parenting of teenagers is about worrying about everything. It's just parenting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you've got the media who's trying to get your attention because that's how they can flash, get you to look, and then sell advertising, which is necessary. But the problem is that it distorts our view about what's really going on. So those things are happening. The real issue is, how is your kid? Frankly, if it was an epidemic, it would still be, how is your kid?
So true.
And so this is where you have to stay connected to your kid, regardless of what the stats are. It helps you know this is more in the range of what's expected or not, so you don't worry unnecessarily. But you're still going to worry if your kid experiments with alcohol at about the age that teenagers experiment with alcohol. Doesn't mean that you're not going to then still be concerned about whether your kid is going to then be using and then be a problem, regardless of whether it's normal for them to do that. So it's keeping that balance in there. So it's getting close to your kid, which leads me to recommend there's all kinds of disciplinary parenting stuff, and there's all kinds of fun ways you can make your kids suffer and have them be punished for what they're doing. But that's and there's a lot of stuff on that.
Yeah.
And I say some things about that too. But I think really what makes the difference is spending time with your kid. Not having them be cult-like where, it's just y'all in the family and nobody goes anywhere or does anything else, but where y'all are eating together multiple times a week. Casual, but concentrated time where you can just check in with them. That y'all do things as a family, regardless of all the stuff that they're doing. And frankly, it's important to think about doing stuff like volunteering, where you help your kid see, I've got difficult things that I'm dealing with, but there's other people who are in need in ways that I'm not. Or there are other people who are in need in the ways that I am, and I can help them.
Wow.
Very powerful, subtle stuff that's also about giving to the community at the same time. So there's that kind of thing that is also important, in addition to what most of us think about with parenting, which is how to kind of, keep them out of trouble, and to what to do when they're not doing their chores, and all of those things which are important. But there's larger issues to also think about and make time for that may end up being as important as what kind of discipline system that you have in place.
I love that.
When we initially, broached this idea of inviting you to the show, we were asking you what are the things that you feel like are of concern right now, and we were surprised, although in retrospect maybe shouldn't have been surprised, that the first thing you said was porn. Now, here we are talking about access to technology and these sorts of things, and my impression is, hearing you talk about all of these ancillary issues, is that porn might be an area that is potentially, I don't know, is damaging the word? Is that something?
Yes.
Okay. So how do you frame a conversation around kids' access to pornography?
Sure. Well, and again, what I want to say, and in terms of what's being found out when this issue is looked at with teenagers. And so it's not just based on who happens to come into my office or what kids I happen to know, but taking what the literature is saying about this and trying to translate that is part of what somebody like me is supposed to be doing, rather than just, hey, this worked for me as a parent, and so I thought I'd suggest you try it too. That's that makes me really nervous. So it's as you might imagine, as all of us actually know and experience, this is a huge issue, and it's overwhelming because for still these days, it's difficult for most of us as parents to talk to our kids about sex and sexuality. Forget about the pornography aspect of it, just sex and sexuality and sexual intimacy. And on top of that, there are no discussions happening about relationships. when you look for, if you as a parent go and look for a book about talking to your kid about dating or about relationships, what you'll find is books about sex, safer sex, sexual violence, and, date rape and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And virtually nothing about relationships. And then if you, of course, just think and realize the movies and the images and the characterizations of relationships that exist in our culture, there are no characterizations of healthy, long-term, committed relationships. They are about hooking up. They are about meeting somebody and being infatuated and falling in love and having that initial romantic relationship, and that's it. And all of those circle around and have been defined by aspects of sex and sexuality and sexual eroticism and sexual desire. And that is only the beginning part of relationships. It will not sustain relationships. And so maybe ironically, while there is all kinds of stuff to talk to your kids about, pornography and its effects and how to make sense of it. And of course, as with everything else, you start with minimizing the likelihood that they can easily access that. And then you go into the parenting part. The place that I end up being is about having parents talk to their kids about how you relate to somebody else, because pornography and the sexualization of people and the media makes you focus on superficial aspects of attraction. And so you're not going to have to worry about that because you didn't even have to teach them that. It just happens. But they don't know about what is important in a relationship. What do you look for in a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner? And so those conversations are not happening. And that's a conversation that even if you kind of get queasy about the sex talks, that's a conversation you can have. And that's an important one that kids are not getting anywhere.
So how is it showing up in your office? What are the kids coming in? What's happening in your office?
The thing that is driving me insane most of the time, sometimes it bursts out of me in the office, but most of the time in my head, okay, is that, so I have kids come in and they're talking about their relationships, and as they are just recounting to me what's going on, it is as though I am listening to the script from one of those pseudo-reality television shows where those kids are sitting with their drinks, sipping out of their straw, with their parents' credit cards. All of them are fabulously wealthy.
Yeah.
And having these pseudo-adult conversations about, well, I'm just not sure if we're ready to be together or whatever. Nothing like what is at the actual developmental level that these kids are at. And so they're imitating these things that they're seeing. And so that issue to me is, and then there are kids who, almost exclusively teenage boys who are, become obsessed with and show signs of addiction to pornography, that it's actually affecting their sexual responsivity. And so there's increasing evidence and there's increasing instance of teenagers and young adult men who are having sexual performance issues because they are using porn so pervasively, it's literally changing their neurochemistry about sex and sexual responsivity. So there's all kinds of stuff about that. And there's ways to talk about that and there's things to think about that. But as I say, this issue of sex and sexuality is always an issue. Teenagers are always drawn to that, and they should be. And it's fun and it's exciting and messy and delicious and wonderful and really risky. And it's relationships where they're really missing out on. And so while those conversations about porn and sex are important, as you can see, I really get caught up in helping parents realize it's about what's important in a relationship that kids need to know about.
Where do you stand on that, on the issue of modeling behavior? I mean, I think in our busy society, right, it's often that we forget that how we relate to our spouse, in a romantic and relationship around our kids.
No question about it.
What does that look like? Because I'm operating off of a hunch, and so
yeah. Well, but it's pretty straightforward that even though there's massive amounts of research on modeling as an influential factor in how people take on and figure out how to do stuff and then begin to act. And so that's absolutely true, especially with a significant social relationship like a parent to a child. So all of that's true. And so, but we're supposed to be paying attention to that. That's like a fundamental part of parenting. Okay. Be a good role model. Everybody knows that. And so that concept is already in your awareness. You may not be paying much attention to it, but that's part of what is really infuriating to me, was infuriating. My kids are now in their mid to late 20s, but was infuriating me about parenting is the things that I had to actually be aware that I was a hypocrite about. And so I would be telling them this stuff. And so it would really tick me off that I'd realize I was not like, this is what I'm telling them to do, but and I'm not even talking about like, really cool, like sexy, like, like problem behavior. I'm talking about just like, being consistent or like, caring empathically for other people. It's like, like basic human decency. I was like, Dad, coming. So that's part of the challenge. That's part of the beauty for us as adults, I find, as kids, is that it also has us reevaluate what we're doing and how we are living our lives. And that becomes important to think about, because you can have a relationship and have your kids be part of a divorced or separated relationship, divided relationship between their parents, and still be able to talk to them about how that went wrong and what's important to do next time. So you don't have to be, luckily, you don't have to be perfect as a parent. The research says good enough.
Yeah.
Not terrible and not perfect. That if you're good enough as a parent, you most of the time, you just about always, you can't kind of make sure that helps kids turn out well, because they're busy guiding their own selves and picking up stuff and being able to kind of do stuff too.
You've set the bar right within my reach. Thanks so much, Jim. That's really exceptional guidance from a professional.
Excellent. I'm mediocre and that's good enough.
Strive for the middle.
Psych!
I climbed to the top of the bell curve.
No, little Johnny, you've got a good enough parent, and that's good enough for you.
That's it. Well, this has been terrific. Michelle, what do you feel like we've missed on our list here? Anything else you want to cover?
No, my brain is swirling. I have so many, I want 2 more hours. I have so many more questions.
Too. There's so much. There's always way too many details for us as parents. And so, I do talks and give seminars and that kind of stuff. And one of the things that is another, to me, important consideration is, first, one of my rules, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so somebody like me, and y'all, therapists and experts have all of these suggestions about things that are like the ideal or the best practice or whatever. But the question for many of us as parents is, when should I change what I'm doing? Mm-hmm. And my position is, if it's working, don't mess with it, regardless of whether it actually fits what some expert is saying. So you really pick and choose these things. If I've got this issue, that's the part that's important to pay attention to. Now, you can have multiple issues, but the point is, everything is not going to be messed up. And if it is, you're going to be hopefully coming into a professional who's going to help get it back into that range. So for most of us, it's that this is a difficult thing for me, even though it's an important issue. And so it's knowing what the important issues are and then figuring out the things that aren't quite working and focusing on that and trusting that the other stuff is going okay. As long as you're watching what your kid is doing, you got to stay close enough to pick up on stuff. But that's always been true about parenting, and it still is.
This is great, great stuff. Jim Wellborn, thank you so much for your time today. What do you want to plug? You've already mentioned the book. We will absolutely put the book, Raising Teens in the 21st Century.
I've got a Twitter account. I got social media stuff. It's all professional. And so for example, my Twitter account really has these quotes that are designed to have some particular relevance. I guess part of what maybe where that came from is that I got a number of years ago, I kind of realized that the thing that drove me insane about my father actually had some legitimacy. And the thing about what he did was, when I was a teenager, especially a young teenager, I'd like come into the house or walk into the room and he'd say, "Jimmy, what have you done for the betterment of mankind today?" And it infuriated me because it's like, what? How do you do something with that? Okay, so then it led to arguments and, all that teenage stuff. But what did I become? Okay, a stupid therapist who's like trying to help people all the time. Okay, so once I worked through my issues with that,
that drove you to Twitter.
It did. I was waiting for Twitter.
Finally, an outlet in 140
wait a minute
characters.
Now, there's a really relevant piece here, and that is, I started thinking really clearly about a more subtle thing that many families do, which is they have a motto, or they have a creed, or they have particular religious scriptures that they quote. And so I have come to suggest to parents, again, as one of these kind of side things. This doesn't address major things in parenting, but it plants seeds. And that is find phrases, find combinations of words, peace, love, and happiness, that you're just going to repeat randomly over and over because your kid cannot do anything about it. They can't keep from it burrowing its way into their brain. And so it's one of those subtle things that you can do, but it also is a fundamental communication of your family values. And that is a crucial message that all of us give to our kids, whether we intend to or not, which is, what does it mean to be a good person? In our family, it means this and this and this. And so that's one of those ways that you can do that. And so there's why for Twitter, I put little sayings and stuff in there that have kind of inspiration or whatever, rather than tweeting about whether I was, at some restaurant or the glorious flowers that are in bloom.
Well, so now I like that. You came to it with so much jokey baggage, but what you've got there is a real gift,
listen,
Jim.
I'm all about jokey baggage. That's I can't not have jokey baggage. That's why people stop working with me sometimes. If they can't take jokey baggage, we're going to have to find a more kind of sincere therapist. But that's a whole other.
This has been a real treat, Jim Wellborn. I didn't know what I expected this morning, but this was not
all at my expense. I'm happy to take it.
This was terrific. Thank you so much for your time and your willingness to share. It's been a real gift. And thank you, Michelle, as always, for your time and wisdom. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you,
again.
Pete.
We've got all of the links and notes to the good Dr. Wellborn's material in the show notes. Make sure you check that out. Head over to michellchalfant.com. On behalf of Jim Wellborn and Michelle Chalfant, I'm Pete Wright, and we will catch you next week right here in the Adult Chair.